In this video, we're going to talk about the 12th movie in the Eon James Bond franchise and the 5th Roger Moore James Bond movie, For Your Eyes Only. This is the movie that intentionally grounded James Bond back to the real world after he blasted off into space in the last film. And the James Bond movies have been trying to go progressively larger and grander since The Spy Who Loved Me took the Bond franchise larger than The Man with the Golden Gun, and Moonraker would go further than The Spy Who Loved Me. And sure enough, this would start a cliche in Hollywood. Whenever a franchise gets bigger and bigger with each installment, you say that they will eventually go into space. The Fast and the Furious franchise played with this cliche. So how do you top Moonraker, where Bond literally went into space? What, do you have Bond meet aliens? Well, you don't. You don't even try. So the filmmakers decided to bring Bond back to Earth. And bringing Bond back to Earth was the mantra for this movie. Eon Films intentionally went in this new direction, emphasizing more on seriousness, on realism, emphasizing more on tension, plot, and character. So the screenwriters decided not to write a film where the entire planet is threatened, but decided to write a kind of smaller movie that sort of returned to the Anglo-Soviet tensions of the Cold War. The villain is not an insanely wealthy billionaire megalomaniac trying to take over the world, but simply a drug smuggler trying to sell stolen British tech to the Russians. Now, I saw this movie when it premiered in the theaters when I was 12 years old, and I saw it opening night with my best friend who was sleeping over for the weekend, and my father took us to see it. And I fell in love with this movie. It had amazing action sequences, an incredible car chase, a breathtaking ski sequence, and the mountain climbing scene that had me on the edge of my seat. It had a gorgeous Bond girl and Carol bouquet, and it had a great musical number. And best of all, it had Roger Moore, cool, suave, and confident in his role as Bond. And then I ended up seeing this movie 2 more times in the theater, and when this movie came out on cable, I saw it dozens of times. For Your Eyes Only is the point at which I really started to become a James Bond fan. It was my love for Your Eyes Only that made me go back and rent all the old James Bond movies, and since For Your Eyes Only, I've been to almost every single James Bond movie in the theaters on opening night. For Your Eyes Only was going to be the movie after The Spy Who Loved Me. So Tom Mankiewicz and Christopher Wood already submitted a screenplay as early as January of 1978. But when this movie started pre-production, they completely threw out the previous version and decided to start over. Richard Maibaum was actually hired to write the screenplay for Your Eyes Only, and Richard Maibaum asked Cubby Broccoli's stepson, Michael G. Wilson, who was being groomed to take over the franchise, to help him write the screenplay. And for inspiration of the story, they went to 2 of Ian Fleming's short stories, For Your Eyes Only and Risico. In For Your Eyes Only, the Havelocks, a British couple who refused to sell their Jamaican estate to Herr von Hammerstein, a former Gestapo officer, well, they're murdered by 2 Cuban hitmen and a Major Gonzalez. James Bond is sent to investigate, and he tracks down Hammerstein, Major Gonzalez, and the 2 Cuban hitmen. However, Hammerstein is killed with a bow and arrow as he dives into a lake. He is killed by Judy Havelock, the daughter of the Havelocks. James Bond kills Major Gonzalez and the 2 Cuban hitmen and returns to Canada with Judy Havelock. In Risico, which means risk in Italian, Bond is sent to investigate a drug smuggling operation in Italy that is bringing in narcotics to England. A CIA informant named Christatos tells James Bond that Enrico Colombo is behind the drug smuggling. While investigating Colombo, Bond is captured by him, and Colombo informs Bond that it is really Christatos who is the drug dealer and that he is also backed by the Russians. Colombo and Bond raid Christatos' ship as they're loading it with drugs, and Christatos almost escapes but is killed by James Bond. And you can see how these 2 films provided the backbone of this movie. This movie marks the promotion of John Glen. And John Glen was the 2nd unit director on Her Majesty's Secret Service, responsible for the amazing sea sequences in that movie. And he was also 2nd unit director on The Spy Who Loved Me and filmed the entire opening ski sequence. He then went over to Warner Brothers and was 2nd unit director on Superman the movie, and then returned as editor on Moonraker. And here they promoted him to the director's chair, and he eventually would go on to direct 5 Bond films: For Your Eyes Only, Octopussy, A View to a Kill, The Living Daylights, and License to Kill. He directed more Bond movies than any other James Bond director, and he's responsible for defining 007 throughout the 1980s and for introducing the entire generation, like me, to the James Bond franchise. Now, it's hard to believe that Roger Moore almost did not star in this movie. Moore had signed a 3-picture deal which ended with The Spy Who Loved Me. And he agreed to do Moonraker on a film-by-film basis, but was unsure if he'd do a 5th movie. Moore said publicly that he was concerned that he was getting too old for 007 and didn't want to do disservice to the beloved character. So it was a classy sentiment, and I really do believe that Moore is a very thoughtful and classy gentleman. However, we know that at the end of the day, Roger Moore wanted to play James Bond for this fifth movie. And we know that Cubby Broccoli wanted Roger Moore for this film. However, it's always this negotiation dance that actors and producers have to do with each other in order to get the best deal for the actor, and for the producer to make sure they don't give the actor too good of a deal.
Negotiation. This is what you do in business.
So Roger Moore pretends he's not interested in playing James Bond in order to get Cubby Broccoli to offer him more money, and Cubby Broccoli always has to remind Roger Moore that there are other actors interested in playing Bond. It's a dance of negotiation. And so Cubby Broccoli strongly considered Timothy Dalton again. However, Timothy Dalton declined because he felt that Moonraker had gone too far with the camp, and he believed James Bond should be a serious spy movie. But Timothy Dalton's time would come soon enough. They then auditioned Michael Billington again, who played Triple X's lover in The Spy Who Loved Me, and was Roger Moore's backup James Bond for Live and Let Die. British actor Lewis Collins was also considered, and he would be best remembered for playing Bodhi in the British TV show The Professionals. And another actor considered was Ian Ogilvy, who had inherited the role of Simon Templar from Roger Moore, portraying Templar in the TV series Return of the Saint. Well, when Roger Moore found out that Cubby Broccoli was auditioning other actors for Bond, he figured, oh well, I guess I'm not Bond anymore, and he announced in an interview that he would not be returning as James Bond. However, Cubby Broccoli met with Roger Moore and basically begged him to do it, and so Roger Moore agreed to be in this fifth James Bond film. But Roger Moore did say that it would be his absolute last Bond film, and apparently at this time, there really was no negotiation. He was really considering being done after For Your Eyes Only. Now, I am really glad that Roger Moore is in this, because I think this is his finest work. And people may think that Spy Who Loved Me is a better movie per se, but I think in For Your Eyes Only, Roger Moore gives a better performance, and arguably gives his best performance as James Bond. Now, interestingly, this will be the last film released by United Artists, because United Artists had released all the previous movies for Eon. However, United Artists is going to end up with some financial difficulties, and at the last minute, they'll merge with MGM, forming MGM UA. And it is MGM UA that will make all the subsequent Bond films, including the Pierce Brosnan films and the Daniel Craig films. However, in 2021, Amazon will purchase MGM and their entire film library, and now they own half of the James Bond franchise, with the Broccoli family owning the other half. But in March 2025, Amazon offered Eon Films and the Broccoli family $1 billion for creative control over the Bond films. So they own half of the James Bond franchise and 100% of the creative control over the direction of the 007 property. And so right now, I just hope they don't kill the golden goose. Now, one superstar who was not available for this movie was James Bond franchise great Ken Adam, who was responsible for some of the most iconic sets of the entire James Bond franchise. Ken Adam was busy as the associate producer of the Steve Martin and Bernadette Peters musical, Pennies from Heaven, and so Moonraker would be his last Eon 007 movie. Therefore, the producers needed a new production designer, and they promoted art director Peter Lamont, who began his career as a draftsman in Goldfinger and as a set director on Thunderball, You Only Live Twice, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and Diamonds Are Forever. And he was promoted to art director in Live and Let Die, The Man with the Golden Gun, The Spy Who Loved Me, and Moonraker. Apparently, Cubby Broccoli called Peter Lamont to his office and told him, Ken Adam is in America making Pennies from Heaven. Who should we hire to take his place? And Peter Lamont said, well, how about me? And that was it. He was promoted to production designer. So sometimes you just have to advocate for yourself. Peter Lamont had a new vision for the Bond movies, whereas Ken Adams created nearly fantastical sets. Peter Lamont wanted to ground his James Bond movies completely in the real world. His mantra was complete realism. And Cubby Broccoli loved this because it also helped significantly decrease the overall budget. And starting with For Your Eyes Only, he will be the head production designer from this movie to Octopussy, A View to a Kill, The Living Daylights, License to Kill, GoldenEye, The World Is Not Enough, Die Another Day, and even Casino Royale. And Peter Lamont would help define the look of the James Bond movies in the modern era. Also, he would serve as production designer for James Cameron's Aliens, True Lies, and Titanic. However, in 2007, he felt that he would be incompatible with director Mark Forrester's vision, as well as he himself turning 78, and so Peter Lamont retired from movies with the 2006 Casino Royale being his last movie. 4 months into production, Bernard Lee, who played Bond's boss M in the first 11 James Bond films, ever since the beginning, Dr. No, died of cancer on January 16, 1981, at the age of 73, and he had not filmed any of his scenes for this film. Out of respect, Cubby Broccoli did not recast him and simply had Chief of Staff Bill Tanner and the Minister of Defense, Sir Frederick Gray, brief Bond at the beginning of the film. Now, for the role of the main Bond girl, they wanted Ornella Moody, who had made quite an impression as Princess Aura in Flash Gordon. In fact, when Roger Maibaum and Michael G. Wilson were writing the screenplay, they had Ornella Moody in mind while writing. However, she insisted that her personal costume designer, Wayne Finkelman, be hired by the production, and Cubby Broccoli refused, and so she walked away from the project. Another actress who was cast to play Melina was Sylvia Crystal, who was known in the US for playing the title character in the softcore French adult film Emmanuelle. This film remains one of the most successful French films of all time. However, she had to be released because she was finishing up starring in Lady Chatterley's Lover. Eon marketing executive Charles Jerry Giroux recommended Carole Bouquet to Cubby Broccoli and John Glen, so the two saw her 1977 French film That Obscure Object of Desire and was totally impressed, and they flew immediately to Milan to offer her the role. Now, incidentally, her voice would be dubbed by Nikki Vanderzil, who had previously dubbed the voice for Ursula Andress's Honey Rider. And Carole Bouquet had this insanely beautiful face, had gorgeous flowing hair, and piercing eyes. Carole Bouquet stars as the Bond girl Melina Havelock, and she's one of my first true Bond girl crushes, because she just has this insanely beautiful face and this sort of subtle, violent intensity mixed with a very likable and charismatic vulnerability. And she totally won me over in this movie. I was completely in love with her. Bouquet was a relatively unknown French actress at the time who'd only been in 5 French films. However, this movie is going to launch her into international superstar status, and she's going to star in over 40 films and become the face of Chanel No. 5 for over 10 years. Now, in the US, she's primarily known as the Bond girl from For Your Eyes Only, but in France, she is a superstar, and to this day, she still makes headlines, and the paparazzi are still obsessed with her. She's been called the French Marilyn Monroe, and her iconic superstar status in France, and she's currently over 60 years old, but if you Google her picture, she looks a lot like Melina Havelock when she was in her 20s. And her life is very interesting, and in some ways kind of tragic, and you can see the comparison between her and Marilyn Monroe. She was romantically attached to Gerard Depardieu from 1997 to 2005. And then in 2005, a scandal broke out when it was discovered that during the presidency of François Mitterrand, who was the French president from 1981 to 1995, had actually secretly wiretapped her. So can you believe that the French president was wiretapping this actress? It was bizarre, but apparently it was rumored she was having an affair with the recent French president, Nicolas Sarkozy, who was president from 2007 to 2012, and the tabloids claim that this president had just become obsessed with her. The affair has not been substantiated, but at the same time, it gives you an idea of how obsessed the French public is with Carole Bouquet, and you begin to understand the Marilyn Monroe references. It should be mentioned that those are not her legs in the poster for this movie. The model who owned those legs were unknown for years, but now we know that it was 22-year-old model Joyce Bartle, and the poster was photographed by Morgan Kane. It is now considered one of the most iconic posters of all time. Morgan Kane achieved that sexy effect by having model Joyce Bartle wear her swimsuit backwards. Now, when I was a teenager, one of the urban legends was that the Bond girl in this movie was once a man. Do you remember hearing this? Maybe people my age might remember this scandal. And of course, some people, including myself for a little bit, wondered if they were talking about Carole Bouquet. But of course, Carole Bouquet is a biological woman and has always been a biological woman. But there is actually a transgender woman who played one of the 11 women who were wearing bikinis in the background in the mansion scene where Locke delivers the money to Hector Gonzalez, the Cuban hitman who murdered Melina Havelock's parents. So the actress in question is Carolyn Cozy, a London model who was born Barry Kenneth Cozy, and she began hormone therapy to become a woman at age 17 and then had sex reassignment surgery. And believe it or not, her life is actually pretty fascinating and worth mentioning here. Carolyn Cozy started her career as a nightclub dancer, and she almost immediately became the most sought-out glamour model in London and even posed for Playboy in 1981. And then that year, she was cast as an extra in this movie, until in 1982, a tabloid outed her as a transsexual. At this time, it was a very different time, and society was not hip to the concept of gender dysphoria. And so she began to receive death threats and began to lose all of her modeling contracts. Until she met a wealthy Italian count, actual European royalty, who fell in love with her. He knew she was a transgender woman, born a biological male, but they were engaged for 4 years, and she became an outspoken advocate for the rights of transsexuals. And in 1983, she sued the British High Courts for transsexuals to be legally recognized as the reassigned gender. And the trial went on and eventually went to Europe's highest court, and after 7 years of legal battle, she won, and the European High Courts actually ruled in her favor. And this is one of the landmark cases where men who get sexually reassigned to women are now legally considered women. To this day, Carolyn Cozy is happily married and living in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, for the bad guy, Aristotle Christastos, they hired Julian Glover. And Ian loved Julian Glover because he was suave and handsome, but had a subtle, sinister look. And in 1967, he was considered as one of the contenders to play James Bond, replacing Sean Connery on Her Majesty's Secret Service, but was only 31 years old at the time of Her Majesty's Secret Service and looked way too young to play Bond. He eventually lost the role to George Lazenby. However, at the time of For Your Eyes Only, he looked way too old to play Bond. Now, the previous year, he had played the Imperial officer General Veers in The Empire Strikes Back.
The shield will be down in moments. You may start your landing.
And today, he is probably best known as Walter Donovan in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. And for the role of Bond ally Milos Colombo, it was Cubby Broccoli's wife, Dana Broccoli, who suggested Chaim Topol. And Chaim Topol was famously known as the Fiddler on the Roof, but it really impressed the producers with his role as Dr. Hans Zarkov in Flash Gordon. The casting happened when Cubby and Dana Broccoli met Chaim Topol at a party in London, and she was a huge fan of his. As they were meeting Topol, "Oh, Topol, nice to meet you. I just had a good idea." Dana turned to Cubby Broccoli and said, "Cubby, what do you think of Topol playing Columbo?" And that was it. That was how he was cast. Incidentally, I have completed the video of Flash Gordon, and will be releasing it after my James Bond series. So in the opening pre-credit action sequence, the film starts with James Bond visiting the grave of his late wife, Teresa Bond. And James Bond married Teresa in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but she was killed at the end of the movie by Blofeld. And the gravestone even reads, "We have all the time in the world," which was the haunting theme of that movie. The idea of Roger Moore's James Bond visiting Teresa's funeral was the idea of director John Glen, who really wanted to layer his James Bond movie with connections to past Bond films, outlining that his Bond was the same character as Sean Connery in Lazenby's Bond. A Bond is picked up by a helicopter, which turns out to be a trap set by Blofeld, or rather an unnamed character who looks like Blofeld, because Eon actually couldn't use the name Blofeld because the name was owned by Kevin McClory. And if you're interested in how Kevin McClory ended up with the rights to the names Spectre and Blofeld, check out my Thunderball video and the next video after Octopussy, Never Say Never Again. Blofeld has rigged the helicopter to be remote controlled, and he enjoys taunting Bond before killing him. And director John Glen came up with the idea for the scene when he saw one of his colleagues had brought his son to work, and John Glen saw this boy enjoying playing with a radio-controlled car at Pinewood Studios. Stuntman Martin Grace played James Bond in the sequence and really hung off the side of the helicopter for the scene. The city itself was the industrial complex of Beckton Gas Works, which John Glen loved the interesting visuals. And 6 years later, this complex will double as a Vietnamese city in Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket. Glen had this crazy idea of the helicopter going inside a building, which from a practical point of view is impossible. So they had a miniature going inside the building, and once inside the building, they had a full-size helicopter mounted on a track appearing to fly inside the building. Blofeld tries to kill Bond, but Bond is able to turn around and eventually, with the helicopter, picks up Blofeld and flies him around the city and then throws him down a chimney shaft. And one can't help but see this as a metatextual middle finger to Kevin McClory, who was constantly in a lawsuit with Eon for the right to use the character. Remember, the main villain of The Spy Who Loved Me was supposed to be Blofeld, but Kevin McClory sued Eon, and the character had to be changed to Carl Stromberg. And here Eon is basically telling Kevin McClory that they don't need Blofeld nor Spectre to make a great James Bond film. And you know, they were absolutely correct. This movie will be the last time Blofeld will be in an Eon-produced James Bond film until 34 years later, until 2015 film Spectre. And the unmanned Blofeld actor was played by John Hollis, and his voice was voiced by Peter Marinker, the man who had redubbed all of Sam Jones's dialogue for Flash Gordon.
Flash Gordon, quarterback, New York Jets.
That's one more James Bond Flash Gordon connection. Now, the tensions between Kevin McClory and Eon Productions will reach a fever pitch next year when Kevin McClory announced that he'll be making a competing Bond film with original Bond actor Sean Connery. And that film is Never Say Never Again. And my next video will be on Never Say Never Again, so please check it out. Now, after the pre-credit action sequence, we get one of the most famous James Bond songs ever. The song is For Your Eyes Only by Sheena Easton, which was a breakout success. I mean, this song was huge, because if you were around in 1981, you'll remember that this song was everywhere on the radio. You couldn't turn on a radio without hearing this song. And for the music, John Barry could not work on this film because he was not allowed to work in the UK for tax reasons. And this was actually common for many wealthy Britons in the 1970s who had to leave the UK to avoid paying high taxes. And so For Your Eyes Only was written by Bill Conti, who was already famous for writing the music to Rocky. And Michael Leeson wrote the lyrics to the song, and to perform the song, they went to Blondie. Blondie, with their lead singer Deborah Harry, was huge in the 1970s and the 1980s with hits like Tide is High, Rapture, and Call Me, as well as many others. And Deborah Harry was so excited to do the music for the movie that she and Blondie wrote their own version of For Your Eyes Only. And when she submitted their song to the producers, it was rejected. Broccoli wanted Bill Conti's version. However, Blondie wanted to perform their own song, not Conti's. And so Blondie was let go, and Sheena Easton was hired to sing the song. Sheena Easton was a 21-year-old Scottish pop singer who had success with her first single, Modern Girl, and her second single, Morning Train. And For Your Eyes Only propelled her to international stardom, and she was nominated for an Academy Award and a Golden Globe in 1982. And she won a Grammy Award for Best New Artist. Maurice Bender, who had created the visuals to the musical montages for every James Bond film, liked the look of Sheena Easton and decided to feature her in the montage. When Maurice Bender first met Sheena Easton, he said, "I must have that face." And as of 2025, she remains the only singer of a Bond theme song to be featured in the musical montage. The movie proper starts with a fishing boat called the St. George's, which turns out to be a covert British espionage ship. And the ship contains the ATAC, which stands for Automatic Targeting Attack Communicator, which is the computer system that coordinates the Royal Navy's fleet of Polaris submarines and fires their missiles.
ATAC, sir. Automatic Targeting Attack Communicator. Uses an ultra-low frequency coded transmitter to order our submarines to launch ballistic missiles.
A mine blows up the St. George's, but the crew members are unable to self-destruct the ATAC before the St. George's sinks. And the ATAC will be the MacGuffin of this movie, sought out by both James Bond and the Russians. And next, we get Melina Havelock, who's visiting her parents, and her father is a marine archaeologist who is secretly working for British intelligence and trying to locate the sunken St. George's ship. But the helicopter pilot who brought Melina to her parents turns out to be a Cuban hitman named Hector Gonzalez, and he assassinates the Havelocks. Melina survives, and we can see that she vows revenge. You can already tell that she's going to be a very different Bond girl, and Melina Havelock is far more fascinating than any previous Bond girl we've seen on screen. Now, Bond arrives at MI6, and he flirts with Moneypenny, and this was another idea of John Glen to continue to layer the movie with old James Bond references. But the scene is a little awkward. The scenes between Sean Connery and Lois Maxwell were magnetic and had such sexual tension between the two. But there's none of that here. The two have always come across like siblings, and here you can also begin to see Lois Maxwell's age. And she comes across like an older sister or an aunt to James Bond in this scene. And without Bernard Lee as M, we get Bill Tanner and Frederick Gray giving Bond his brief. And he gets his mission with the title of the movie. And this is the first time MI6 Chief of Staff Bill Tanner is named. He's played by James Villiers here, and the Chief of Staff was unnamed in The Man with the Golden Gun, but was played by Michael Goodliff. And Bill Tanner will become a James Bond staple. In the Pierce Brosnan films, Bill Tanner was played by Michael Kitchens, and in the Daniel Craig films, he was played by a much younger Rory Kinnear. And Bond rides off to Spain in his famous Lotus from The Spy Who Loved Me, and he arrives at the mansion of Hector Gonzalez. And here's Caroline Cossey, by the way. And Bond witnesses a mysterious man paying off Gonzalez. Bond is captured, but just as Gonzalez is diving into the pool, a crossbow arrow strikes him in the back, killing him. And remember, this is exactly like the scene from Ian Fleming's short story. Now, John Glen wanted a movie where James Bond has to use his wits rather than rely on cartoonish gadgets. So in the opening act, he had his Lotus blow up, and he has to survive by driving this beat-up Citroën 2C. And John Glen stated that he intentionally inserted this as a metaphor for the new direction of the James Bond films, and I think it totally worked. And I do love the scene where the Lotus blows up, although it's always sad to see a great car like the Lotus blow up. It's always fun to imagine if we had this gadget, and if someone ever tried to break into our cars, they would get the same fate. This man trying to break into James Bond's car is played by legendary stuntman Bill Simmons, who was the original James Bond in the gun barrel sequence of the first 3 movies. And the car chase through the countryside of Spain is fun, it's exciting, and it is energetic. And it's such a great action scene, and incredibly well choreographed, and extremely fun to watch. And in my opinion, it is arguably one of the most entertaining car chases in all of cinema. And the humble Citroën 2CB is a popular French economy car. In 1981, Citroën released the 2CB 007 edition of their popular car. And it was painted yellow like the movie, with a 007 sticker across the side, and even had sticker bullet holes all around the vehicle. And a miniature version of this model car was extremely popular. And the Citroën 2CB remains one of the most iconic and popular cars of James Bond. James Bond goes back to MI6 and gets chewed out by his bosses for letting Gonzalez get killed. But he mentions that he did notice a mysterious man paying off Gonzalez. And enter Q, who has a 64K computer, which looks like an old Commodore, with an old dot matrix printer. Now, it may look low-tech today, but I remember in 1981 seeing this and realizing that in the future, computers would be able to do everything. Now, Q is able to identify the man using Bond's description, and he is Emile Leopold Locke, who has been identified in Cortina, northern Italy. Inside Q Lab, in the background is a scientist named Smithers, who is testing a fake cast. And he'll also appear as the same character in Octopussy. And he is played by Jeremy Bulloch, who played Boba Fett in The Empire Strikes Back. Bond heads to Cortina in a maroon version of the Lotus, where he meets his contact, Ferrara. And Ferrara introduces Bond to Eris Christatos, a Greek businessman who is funding a young ice skater named Bibi Doll. And Christatos tells Bond that Locke works for a Greek smuggler named the White Dove. Then Bond runs into Melina, who is purchasing a crossbow. Then assassins and motorcycles try to kill her, but Bond takes them down, and Bond is able to convince Melina that she's in danger and to wait for him while he investigates. And when Bond returns to the hotel, Bibi Doll is waiting for him, and she's played by figure skater Holly Lynn Johnson, who won the silver medal in the 1974 U.S. Figure Skating Championship, but in 1977 gave up figure skating to pursue acting. She starred in Ice Castles, and it was in this movie that Cubby Broccoli saw her and cast her in this movie. Michael G. Wilson stated that Bibi was intentionally written to annoy Bond. And in this movie, Bibi Doll was supposed to be 16 years old. However, in real life, the actors Bibi, Holly Lynn Johnson, and Carol Bouquet were roughly the same age. Holly Lynn Johnson was 22 years old, while Carol Bouquet was 23. Bond and Bibi go skiing, and we meet Eric Kriegler, an East German Olympic biathlete, and he's going to be the main henchman of this movie. And he tries to kill Bond from a distance, and as Bond skis away, more bad guys and motorcycles chase him. Now, originally the bad guys were going to be on snowmobiles, but John Glen had the idea that motorcycles may appear more sinister. And this is one of the best action sequences in the entire James Bond franchise, and it is so entertaining. Because John Glen turned to the same team that he used to film the ski sequences in On Her Majesty's Secret Service and in The Spy Who Loved Me. This included ski unit director Willie Bogner Jr., And Willie Bogner and John Glen came up with the entire ski sequence of this movie and designed it as an evolution of the ski sequences of the previous two movies. And personally, I feel that this is one of the best action sequences ever filmed. It's so brilliantly choreographed. And as for me, I grew up in Colorado and I grew up skiing. And ever since I saw this movie at the age of 12, every time I'd ski, I would hum the James Bond theme in my head as I skied. And believe it or not, I still do it. Bond spots Kriegler talking to Locke, and we assume that they must both work for Columbo. But of course, we'll later learn that they both work for Christatos. And another goon working for Locke is Charles Dance, and we can see him clearly as Bond is riding the elevator. And this movie is Charles Dance's feature film debut, but he's going to have a fantastic career. He'll immediately land the role of the villain in The Golden Child, then The Last Action Hero, and then Underworld Awakenings, and many, many more, but is best remembered as Tywin Lannister in the Game of Thrones. But it all started here. We also get some funny Roger Moore moments, like when he makes a class of beginner skiers fall down. And then we get Victor Turjansky, also known as the alcoholic or the man with the bottle, making his third and final debut. He was there when James Bond drove the Lotus out of the water, he was in Venice when Bond drove his gondola hovercraft, and he's here now as Bond skis down the mountain. And according to Bond lore, not only are all three guys played by the same actor, it is supposed to be the same character. And even the most cynical Roger Moore haters will have to admit that this ski scene is fantastic. And at one point, Bond skis off a ski jump wearing downhill skis. And in a highlight, he even skis down a bobsled course. And this is likely an homage to James Bond chasing Blofeld on the bobsled in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but boy, this scene is incredible here, and it blows away the previous scene. Now, unfortunately, while filming this scene, it actually ended in tragedy when one of the stuntmen, 23-year-old stuntman named Paolo Regan, was actually killed during the last day of shooting. While shooting the bobsled scene, the bobsled flipped over and Regan was trapped underneath, and he later died in the hospital from injuries he sustained during that accident. That night, Bond and Ferrara meet up with Bibi to get some information on Kriegler, but he's attacked by killer hockey players. And when he returns to the Lotus, Ferrara has been strangled to death, and the assassin has left a white dove symbol, suggesting that Columbo killed Ferrara, and likely hired the killer hockey players. Now remember, in the Q Lab, we learned that Emile Leopold Locke likes to strangle his victims, so it is likely that Ferrara was killed by Locke. Although we'll later find out that he's only trying to frame Columbo, and Locke really works for Christatos. But Bond is on the trail of Milos Columbo, who is now on the Greek island of Corfu. And he meets up with Molina, and we get a cool tour of Corfu, and it is really a beautiful and exotic locale. Bond and Christatos check on Columbo, who is also at a restaurant with his mistress, Countess von Schlaff, played by Cassandra Harris, and she takes Bond to her house. And here's an interesting bit of trivia. Pierce Brosnan visited the set of For Your Eyes Only when he was only 23 years old, and at that time he was married to Cassandra Harris, who played Countess Liesl von Schlaff. And Cassandra Harris really wanted Pierce Brosnan to one day play James Bond, and intentionally brought her husband to the set so that he could meet Cubby Broccoli. Well, it worked. The entire production team, as well as producer Albert Broccoli, was fascinated by Brosnan, and they're all thinking the same thing. This guy looks like he could be the next James Bond. And so Albert Broccoli took Pierce Brosnan and Cassandra Harris out to lunch and was even quoted as saying, "If he can act, he's my guy." And of course, the next year, Brosnan was cast as Remington Steele, proving that he could act, and he'd be inching closer and closer to one day playing Bond, although that wouldn't happen for another 14 years. Now, sadly, a few years after this movie, Cassandra Harris would be diagnosed with ovarian cancer and would eventually succumb to it in 1991 and pass away at the tragically young age of 43. Pierce Brosnan supported her, adopted her 2 children from a previous marriage, and stayed by her side until her passing. And Pierce Brosnan is such a class act. In the morning, Bond and Countess Liesl are having a morning stroll when Locke and his men, dressed in the clothes of the White Dove, attack them and ultimately kill Liesl. And just when Locke and his right-hand man, played by Charles Dance, have the drop on Bond, he is rescued by frogmen who also have wetsuits with the White Dove logo on them. And Bond is so confused. But these guys are the real White Dove, and we learn that Columbo is the good guy and Christatos is the real villain. And I thought this was a great twist straight out of Ian Fleming's short story, Risico. And Topol is great here as Columbo, and he has this charisma that rivals Roger Moore. And Topol himself came up with this idea of his character always snacking on pistachios. Columbo takes Bond on a raid of Christatos' ship, and sure enough, not only does Locke work for him, he is indeed smuggling heroin. And Bond also discovered old naval mines like the ones that sank the St. George's. And now he knows that it is Christatos that sank the St. George's and is after the ATAC. This raid was filmed with over 30 stuntmen, including legendary James Bond stuntman Bob Simmons, who had worked with Bond ever since Dr. No and even played Sean Connery's Bond in the opening gun barrel sequence for the first 3 James Bond movies. Now, in one of the most artistic action sequences, Bond chases the evil henchman Locke, who is driving up a monastery in Albania, and Bond runs up the flight of stairs before confronting Locke head on. And I think this scene shows the brilliance of John Glen, because a lesser director may have chosen to add music in order to add to the intensity, but John Glen brilliantly leaves the scene silent, with only a quiet hum of the car superimposed on Bond's footsteps, and it creates this real quiet intensity. Bond shoots Locke, who almost falls over the cliff, but Bond throws the white dove emblem, and then you see Locke kind of helpless and pleading for help, and James Bond just looks at him and gives the car a violent kick, which makes the car fly over the cliff, killing him. And it is a shocking moment. Roger Moore himself even expressed concern that this might be out of character with Bond. However, John Glen convinced him to do it, and John Glen felt that this was perfectly in line with Roger Moore's Bond, but was just giving him a harder edge to the character. And they were both right. It was out of character and surprised a lot of old school Roger Moore fans, but on the other hand, it was a fantastic moment, and the scene totally works. And as a teenager watching this, it was one of the most defining aspects of Bond, showing us that there is this dangerous cold-blooded killer underneath the kind and likable gentleman exterior. And in retrospect, it is one of Roger Moore's finest moments as James Bond. Bond heads to the Ionian Sea and meets up with Melina. And I never noticed that Melina looks different underwater, and this is because all of her scenes were done on land, not underwater. And that's because Carol Bouquet had either bad sinuses or problematic inner ear. Either way, they hurt when she went scuba diving in the water. And therefore, all of her scenes were done by blowing her hair with a huge wind machine and then slowing the footage. And this was done by speeding up the film to 80 frames a second and then playing it at normal speeds of 24 frames per second. So basically, it was slowed down to 4 times the normal speed. And then they added bubbles to the scene by simply putting Alka-Seltzer imposed on the negatives. And it looks convincing. You know, for years I never realized that she wasn't scuba diving. And then for some crazy reason, Bond and Melina decide to leave her scuba equipment here in the water, but of course this will totally pay off later. Bond and Melina get a small submarine and find the ATAC, but then they're attacked by Christatos' villain in this diving suit, but then they kill him and escape, and when they return to the boat, Christatos and his men are waiting for them. He takes the ATAC, which he intends to sell to the KGB, and then ties them up and drags them on his boat to attract sharks. And this is known as keel hauling, and was a form of punishment and execution at sea where sailors were tied and dragged under the keel of the ship. And the scene was from the book Live and Let Die, but was not used in the movie, but John Glen and Richard Maibaum had the idea to use it here. Now the scene was not shot underwater. Remember, bad sinuses. When you see Melina and James Bond, they were actually on land. I think the scene looks convincing, and it doesn't detract at all from the action. Now when the ship turns, Bond and Melina grab the scuba equipment, allowing them to stay underwater for a long time, and they tie the rope around some rocks, which breaks the rope, allowing them to escape. Bond and Melina have lost the ATAC, but Max the Parrot saves the day. Remember, they set up that Max repeats everything, and he repeats the plan of Christatos, which is to take the ATAC to St. Cyril's.
ATAC to St. Cyril's! ATAC to St. Cyril's!
So Bond and Melina get help from Columbo and his men to help assault Christatos on St. Cyril's. And now the final climax scene is one of the most clever action sequences ever. It is so simple and yet so suspenseful. Now the fortress at St. Cyril's Monastery was actually filmed at the Monastery of the Holy Trinity, the holy community of Meteora, located in central Greece. And the church was constructed in the 14th century, and sure enough, it was built by monks who had to carry up supplies and built the monastery with a rope and basket. and it is considered a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Eon Productions had to pay the local bishops of the Greek Orthodox Church to film the movie there and got permission from the Greek Orthodox Church to film. However, it appears that the local bishop kept the money and forgot or simply did not tell the monks of Meteora about the filming crew. Nor apparently did the local bishop give the monks any of the money that Eon paid. So when Eon arrived, the monks refused to work with the filming crew, nor did they allow them in the monastery. And the monks even started sabotaging the filming by putting laundry in the scene and things like that. So the filming crew built a similar looking monastery on a neighboring rock to film the ending of the movie. And all the interior scenes were filmed inside a soundstage at Pinewood Studios and was designed by Peter Lamont. Meanwhile, a legal battle began between the monks of the Meteora versus the local government of the area. And this case even reached the Greek Supreme Court. The Greek judges eventually decreed that the monks had the right to refuse all interior shots of the monastery, but the external view of the monastery belonged to local government and could be used by the Eon film crew. And this allowed them to use the external shots of Meteora. James Bond rock climbs up St. Cyril's mountain to attack the fortress, and this was early 1980s, the beginning of the rock climbing fad. And it not only reflected the growth of this up-and-coming fad, but may have even helped popularize it as a new sensation. And I have to admit, my best friend, who I watched this movie with together, began to rock climb after this movie, and while it really wasn't my sport, he actually went on to become a professional level rock climber. So I guess he can thank For Your Eyes Only for fueling his passion for rock climbing. One of Christastos' men, Apostas, knocks off a carabiner, and Bond falls off the side of the mountain and is stopped by a single carabiner. And this was a fantastic stunt and had me on the edge of my seat. And the drop was performed by stuntman Rick Sylvester. He was the one that did the ski jump parachute scene in the opening pre-credit teaser for The Spy Who Loved Me. And he apparently said that when he did this, he himself was actually scared to do the scene. After all, the moment he reaches the bottom of the rope, he is jerked to a stop, and this could create enough force to really injure him. So Derek Meddings, who did the special effects, created a contraption where a bunch of sandbags would slow his descent at the end, decreasing the violent jerk. And it worked. Rick Sylvester was not injured, and he was relieved that the stunt worked, without any injuries. And the scene is terrifying, and it works out really well, and I think it's just an amazing understated action sequence that just works so well and maximizes the suspense. We are right there really concerned for Bond, and this is what cinema is all about. And while most of the climbing sequence was done by Rick Sylvester, Roger Moore did some of the safer climbing for up-close shots, which also included hanging 4 feet off a mountain. And Roger Moore had a terrible fear of heights and had to take a Valium with a glass of beer in order to do the scene. Bond climbs back up on the rope with his shoelaces, and this technique of using shoelaces on a rope to ascend a mountain was known as the Prusik knot, and it was invented by Austrian mountaineer Karl Prusik in 1931. And when he climbs back to the top, he throws a spike like a throwing knife and kills Apostas, who falls from the top of St. Cyril's all the way to the bottom. He's dead. Bond activates the basket and brings all of Columbo's men up, and Bond has a showdown with Kriegler, and Kriegler is also thrown off of St. Cyril's. Yep, he's also dead. Bond grabs the ATAC from Christastos, but Melina is about to kill him with her crossbow, but Bond warns her about the stakes of revenge. Christastos is about to kill Bond, but is saved by Columbo and a throwing knife. General Gogol arrives to take the ATAC, but Bond throws it over St. Cyril's and sends it crashing below.
That's Dayton, comrade. You don't have it? I don't have it.
And Gogol smiles with respect. The movie ends with Q, Chief of Staff, and the Minister of Defense patching Bond through to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. But Bond and Melina have gone swimming, so the Prime Minister is talking to Max the Parrot. And Margaret Thatcher was played by comedian Janet Brown, who in the 1970s and 1980s was famous in England for performing impersonations of Margaret Thatcher. As ridiculous as it sounds, I remember seeing this as a kid and wondering if they got the real Margaret Thatcher to play her. And thus ends one of my favorite James Bond films of all time. For me, the film that started my James Bond obsession. How many people remember when James Bond is climbing the mountain, in one scene he actually reaches for a ledge and a pigeon flies out and scares him, and thus us, the audience. This is John Glen's trademark, and he thought of it here. And in subsequent films, he'll always have a flying pigeon scaring the protagonist in almost every movie he's directed. He believes that it invests the audience in the scene when this happens. In For Your Eyes Only, it happens here when Bond is climbing St. Cyril's. It happens in Octopussy when James Bond is climbing the ledge of Kamal Khan's house. It happens in The Living Daylights when he's at night ready to attack Whitaker's house in Tangiers. Bond is scared by pigeons by the pool. It happens in License to Kill when James Bond is ready to put explosive toothpaste in front of Sanchez's window. The only film not to have a pigeon is A View to a Kill, where instead of pigeons, you get a cat that gives Bond the false scare at Stacey Sutton's house, and also use Stacey Sutton's birds in a birdcage in San Francisco to give you a false scare. The pigeon false scare is definitely a John Glen hallmark, which he himself has talked about. It's his Alfred Hitchcock cameo. However, there are also some other minor trends and patterns that James Bond fans have noticed that appear in all 5 of John Glen's James Bond films. Another common John Glen trope is that the villain always seemed to fall from a great height to his death, usually requiring a mannequin for the scene. In For Your Eyes Only, the henchman Apostas falls off of St. Cyril's to his death, and so does Kriegler. In Octopussy, Kamal Khan's henchman Gobinder falls off of Khan's flying airplane to his death. In A View to a Kill, 2 men fall from a great distance. One, a businessman, is thrown out of Zorin's blimp, and then Zorin himself falls to his death from the blimp atop the Golden Gate Bridge. In The Living Daylights, Necros falls out of the flying transport plane after Bond cuts his shoelaces. And finally, in License to Kill, Bond kicks 2 men out of the aircraft to their deaths. And another John Glen trope is that Bond's close ally and fellow secret agent is murdered by the main villain. In For Your Eyes Only, CIA contact Ferrara is killed by Locke. In Octopussy, the MI6 agent in India is killed. In A View to a Kill, Sir Godfrey Tippett and CIA agent Chuck Lee are killed by Zorin. And in The Living Daylights, MI6 agent Saunders is killed by Necros. And finally, in License to Kill, Felix Leiter's friend and Bond ally Sharkey is killed by Sanchez. And finally, all of John Glen's Bond movies each have a spectacular action-packed car chase where Bond is clearly the underdog in a car chase. In For Your Eyes Only, James Bond escapes multiple killers while driving a beat-up Citroën 2CV. In Octopussy, Bond survives assassins by escaping in a tuk-tuk through the streets of Mumbai. In A View to a Kill, Bond is chased through the streets of Paris by multiple police cars while his car is missing the top and the back half of the car. In The Living Daylights, Bond has the upper hand with his Aston Martin V8, but is chased by the entire East German army and ends up escaping by riding the case of a cello. And finally, in License to Kill, Bond is dropped on the top of a tanker and has to commandeer it while Sanchez and his men pursue with machine guns. Now apparently, director John Glen and Roger Moore had a great working relationship. John Glen loved working with Roger Moore, and Roger Moore also loved working with John Glen, and in fact the two were close friends, and in 2007, it was Roger Moore who wrote John Glen's biography. Now something very odd happened during the premiere of this film. The premiere was shown to Prince Charles and his fiancée at the time, Lady Diana Spencer, at a charity benefit for the Royal Association for Disability and Rehabilitation. And nothing wrong with that, right? After all, Prince Charles was a huge James Bond movie fan. And it seemed like a good idea at the time, until you realize that the opening scene you have James Bond throwing a man in a wheelchair down a chimney chute. This caused a lot of people, a lot of royal and wealthy elite people of England, to complain about the insensitivity of the producers. And I gotta admit, they kinda have a point. And again, I really shouldn't laugh. However, the movie did go on to become a huge financial success. Made on a budget of $28 million, which was $6 million less than the previous movie, the film would go on to be a smash hit. The movie made $54 million in the US, which is equivalent to about $200 million in today's money when adjusted for inflation. And it became the second highest grossing Bond movie ever, unadjusted for inflation, only slightly less than Moonraker. And if you factor in the budget, For Your Eyes Only had a more successful box office to budget ratio than Moonraker. It went on to make $194 million worldwide, which is equal to about $700 million in today's money. In fact, the financial success of this movie probably saved United Artists. United Artists had just lost over $40 million due to Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate in 1980, and United Artists had to file for bankruptcy. And when this film raked in $194 million at the box office, it saved United Artists from directly going under and set up the scenes that allowed for the MGM merger, which allowed United Artists to survive a few more decades. Furthermore, this film received mixed to positive reviews from the critics. Most critics praised the action, but many critics felt that Roger Moore was getting a little old to play James Bond. However, time has been very kind to this film, with now people considering it one of the best James Bond movies. In 2006, IGN ranked this the number 6 best James Bond film out of 21 films, and MSN said that For Your Eyes Only is one of the best Roger Moore films that rivals Sean Connery's James Bond movies. And in 2008, Entertainment Weekly rated For Your Eyes Only number 10 best James Bond film out of 22 films. The film was nominated for an Academy Award for Bill Conti's theme, For Your Eyes Only, and it was also nominated for a Golden Globe. And at the Academy Awards, Albert R. Broccoli was honored with a lifetime Irving G. Thalberg Memorial Award. And Roger Moore himself has gone on record to say that The Spy Who Loved Me and For Your Eyes Only were his 2 favorite James Bond films. And both movies were re-released after his death as a tribute to Roger Moore. And half of the proceeds were donated to UNICEF, for which he served as a Goodwill Ambassador. And for those like me who grew up in the 1980s and saw this movie in the theater, my favorite merchandising tie-in was the comic book. Marvel Comics released a comic book adaptation of For Your Eyes Only, written by Larry Hama and drawn by Howard Chaykin, and it was only the second comic book tie-in since Dr. No, although Marvel would later publish the comic book version of Octopussy in 1983. And after this movie, Roger Moore believed that he would not return for James Bond. Again, he really felt this time that he was getting way too old to play an action star and was concerned that he was doing the character a disservice. And producers began to audition other actors, including American actor James Brolin. And they also interviewed Lambert Wilson and perennial favorite Timothy Dalton. And however, in my next podcast, I'm going to talk about what factors led Roger Moore returning as James Bond for what he thought would be one more film. And that is that a competing James Bond film, Never Say Never Again, starring Sean Connery, was about to hit the theaters before Octopussy. And this meant that Roger Moore would be absolutely crucial. So I'm going to talk about Octopussy in my next video, and then I'm going to talk about Never Say Never Again. For Your Eyes Only is arguably one of the best James Bond films, and it holds its own against any of the best Connery films. I've personally seen it over 100 times, and it ranks as my favorite James Bond movie, probably second only to the 2006 Casino Royale. And it ranks as one of my favorite movies, period, of any genre. Well, that ends my video on For Your Eyes Only, and if you like this video, please check out my videos on Goldfinger, on The Spy Who Loved Me, and Moonraker. And please tell me what you thought of For Your Eyes Only, and where it ranks among your favorite James Bond movies. And that ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time.